Hi everybody, this is Warren Herman, and so today we're going to talk about an easy method for recovery from the problem of religious scrupulosity. So one of the problems we can have um, in, when we're living our spiritual life is, and even in our psychological life, just to be perfectly honest, is when we're trying not to think about something. So, for example, if I tell you don't think about pink elephants, it just doesn't work. There's actually a term for this which is called the ironic process of the mind, which means when you try not to think about something, it's what you have to think about. So, one of the problems we have is when we don't want, let's use a silly example. Let's say we don't want to be full of ourselves. So let's say there's a person who has a good singing voice or something like that, and they are afraid that they're going to be puffed up with self-importance when they sing. So they're trying not to think this way. So then every time they sing, they have this kind of weird focus on their voice, and they don't understand why they can't get rid of this. The problem is that they are trying not to feel pride about their voice. So therefore, what happens, it's almost like when if you take, I don't know if you've seen a squeezy stress ball, and sometimes they're kind of, you can't really see too much into them, but when you squeeze them, you can see all these little bubbly things inside. And the same thing happens to the unconscious mind. I don't want to be proud, and all of a sudden pride becomes kind of secreted out of your unconscious mind, so to speak, because it's what you consciously don't want. So, another thing that another principle we can put into play is, in this, it's kind of like not thinking about something is something that kind of just happens. That's an unconscious process. And when you're trying not to think about something, you are consciously trying to help an unconscious process along. It's kind of like if you try to fall asleep, it will not work because that is not a process that is controlled by your conscious willpower. So that's really gives you some trouble. So one of the things that I really want to share this video because there is an endless amount of torture that people can experience if they try to not sin in a kind of a fearful way. Because what happens, let's say that person is trying, let's say this person's singing in church, they're saying, I don't want to be prideful. Automatically they would think prideful thoughts. Let's say they don't want to judge people. Automatically, judgments will leap into their mind because they're so afraid of judging others. And I'm going to speak about a more sensitive subject because this video is something that I believe will bring you liberation from this. So a lot of times some people can feel that they're experiencing impure thoughts or impure glances at people, and it can kind of start taking on a life of its own. Like they maybe they say they really want to be pure, and they all of a sudden they start to experience attractions to people all the time, and they're like, what is this? They're so afraid to they're so afraid of these things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some general principles. I've made some videos about this before, but I want to reiterate maybe even a simpler way of understanding this. In order to do this, I'm going to kind of introduce this technique with an image from the movie The Matrix. And this is an old movie now. It was about, this guy who kind of wakes up to the fact that reality is made out of a computer program, basically. And I won't spoil it beyond that. I don't necessarily recommend watching it, but because it's kind of violent and has some semi-impure things in it as well. But it's an interesting story, and there's a really interesting scene where he goes to this house, and there is kind of a little boy holding a spoon, trying to bend it with his mind. Again, these are not things we should be doing in real life. These are improper things to be involved with. But again, so there's a little boy bending the spoon, and he says, he's watching the little kid bend the spoon, and he says, he's kind of trying to figure out how it works. The main character is kind of trying to figure it out. And the kid's like, just realize there is no spoon. Now, and then the main character looks at the spoon goes, kind of spins around in a circle. So what does this movie scene about there not being a spoon and kind of seeing through this reality and causing it to bend, what does this have to do with how to overcome scrupulosity, especially fearful, fear of impure attractions, but that we experience in daily life? Now, it's really important to understand. I think I'm going to give my opinion on this, but I don't think that I think my opinion is grounded enough in real principles that it's not really like it's just my opinion. It's grounded in some real teachings, and it's also grounded in psychology type things. Not that I'm saying this is medical treatment or something, it's like, but I think it has some validity to it. And this is something that I'm speaking from because this is a principle that I know from my experience that it brings freedom. So I really want to encourage you with that. So the way this works, there's a lot of things I've said in previous videos, so I may reiterate some of these concepts, but the essential thing that I want to add that's new is this concept. This concept is notice that there's no problem, or notice your freedom. That's the instruction. Notice how you are free. Notice how you don't have a problem. Now that may sound extensively simple. That may sound bizarre, but it's about seeing. It's about just looking for and seeing how you don't have a problem. And what do I mean by this? And the thing is, I probably should lay out some context. So, for example, we have to understand that there can, in a way, be problems. So, what is dangerous about sin? So, a sin is dangerous because we can potentially go to hell, which is the most dangerous thing that could possibly happen. So that is what is dangerous about sin. Now, what we're going to do, so when you commit, there's differences between venial and mortal sins. So there are also things that this is really not usually taught, so I want to add this into the video. This is something from, there are also phases of consent to sin, which is really important to know both phases of consent and the conditions necessary for mortal sin. And the way the phases of consent kind of connect to the idea of the conditions of mortal sin is in the area of the criteria for mortal sin, which is called full consent of the will. So what we're going to do is let's unpack these things. So I almost like to actually add a fourth category here. Because there is technically a fourth category, which is like impairment. So, for example, if someone has a gun to your head, or you're really half asleep, or you're like completely like on a medicine and don't really know what's happening, and you happen to do some crime in the middle of those states, you can't commit a mortal sin while sleepwalking, even if you push someone off of a bridge while sleepwalking, because you're just not there. So, or, if you drive the getaway car because someone puts a gun to your head and you're terrified, it's not like you're like, hey, you're now an accomplice of the bank robber in the same way you would be if you were really robbing the bank. So it's like these are, there are impairments. That's one thing. So we have to have no impairments in that way. And then we also it has to be grave matter. Like it can't be like, oh, I really consented to eating pea soup. I really consented to eating a tomato. There's nothing sinful about eating any of these. Like you can't sin by like doing something that isn't prohibited. Now, there's also a slight technicality where if you really think, if you thought you were doing something terrible, there's some, if I really thought it was offensive to God to eat pizza and I did it on purpose to offend him, then we may have a problem. But the thing is, but we don't want to but we want to really understand that, there has to be grave matter, or you have to really be thinking you're sinning. That's my understanding of this first criteria. The other thing, we have to have sufficient reflection. So you can't be like, okay, all of a sudden someone jumps out and you get startled and you say, like use the Lord. I'm just giving an example. Use the Lord's name in vain. When someone leaps out and scares you, like, but you had zero reflection that this was happening, it was sudden, there was no time for you to think, then that's not necessarily a mortal sin. You know, or like, or you really weren't, or you were like, you were kind of, your mind was kind of wandering. This is also, for example, like if you're thinking about something, you're like, okay, you're thinking about somebody, and all of a sudden you start thinking, like, start judging them. Oh, and all of a sudden you kind of wake up out of the, oh, I shouldn't have been thinking that. Okay, that's not sufficient reflection. Father Ripperger teaches that in his book, The Science of Mental Health. And it's also done in teachings about impurity. So, for example, we're only responsible for turning our mind away from improper things when we all of a sudden realize we are thinking about improper things. Like it's like if you don't really even realize what you're doing, there's a sense in which it may be sinful, maybe venially sinful, but maybe if you're asleep, not sinful at all. It's like depending on how little reflection there is. So that's kind of one of the other criteria. And the thing is, and then the last criteria is, I said grave matter, sufficient reflection, full consent to the will, and that's where we're going to get into these phases of sin, which usually aren't taught about. It's kind of a rarer teaching to find. So the thing is, let's say it's wrong to punch someone in the face for no reason. So that would be a sin of kind of wrath of some kind. Let's say that all of a sudden the thought of punching somebody I know, maybe I don't like them for some reason, they did something to me, the thought of punching them comes into my head. That's the phase called suggestion. There's no sin in the fact that the thought came into your head. You didn't will it to be there, it just popped in your head because you saw them and it wasn't, why don't you punch Jim? That's a suggestion. Then there is a thing called, there's a phase called like enjoyment, and in the Eastern churches, they call it struggle. So it's either like, it's like a disturbance or an enjoyment based on that thought, based on, like, obviously if it's like a angry thought, it might not be that enjoyable, but maybe it is, I'll punch her in the face. But there's like an impulse toward it, which is a movement of the appetites. So that's one of the things that moves toward the appetites there. And so there's this sense that, that there's this movement, the appetites kind of go toward it. And there's a sense, though, at this phase, there is still not yet any consent of the will. Now, here is the part when someone is experiencing scrupulosity. This is what St. Francis de Sales talks about. He talks about consent that happens in the inferior part of the soul. So, for example, this is for folks who are dealing with issues of impurity. You are walking along, you have all of a sudden you might see someone, and all of a sudden you experience a kind of attraction. And it seems as if you have had an experience of consenting to that attraction, but that is the movement of the appetites. I mean, especially if you're the kind of person who's like trying to not look at people impurely, what's likely going on is that you're experiencing this movement of the appetites toward that person. So your will is not yet moved, so that's that. There's also, then the next phase would be the movement of the will, which would be consideration. So, for example, for things like, they talk about the vehemence of the passion has to do with what things you can consider. I've seen this taught a slightly different ways at some places, but the general principle that I understand it is that you cannot consider things things of impurity, not because in itself that's always a near occasion of sin. Like you can't consider doing impure things. However, you could consider robbing the bank. It may be somewhat sinful to consider robbing the bank. It may just be like, oh, that'd be interesting to rob the bank. But, it may not yet be a mortal sin because you've not fully consented to robbing the bank. You've simply been like, maybe it'd be a good thing to rob the bank. I don't know, maybe not. I'm not sure. It looks like good, looks kind of good from this angle, looks kind of bad. But you can't do that with impurity because you don't have a biological drive to rob banks. but you have a biological drive to reproduce. So you can't put yourself in that position without being in danger, and you're going to consideration is tantamount to consent in sins of impurity. That's the understanding. But the thing is that, but again, the next step that we're kind of getting to is this full consent of the will. This fact that you have fully consented to doing something improper. Your will said yes, I'm going to rob the bank, or you have deliberately thought about the impure thing. Then you've committed a mortal sin. Now the thing is, mortal sin is obviously terrible. Now, and there's actually other phases of sin that are such as the kind of habits and enslavement that happen to sin after this. And actually the consent happens before the commission of the sin. So I may commit a mortal sin, say, hey, I'm going to rob that bank, or I'm going to kill that person, and I may not actually go out and do it, but I'm still culpable for it. Even though I have not put it into action. And then eventually the actions become bad habits and so on and so forth. So I hope that's helpful. So the criteria are, you're not impaired, sufficient reflection, full consent of the will, and grave matter. So, that's kind of what you want to have in mind, and understanding that on that spectrum of full consent of the will, we have to understand those stages of consent. Now, why am I talking about this? How is this going to get to this new technique that is going to help us be free of scrupulosity? Well, this and some other principles are going to give us enough knowledge about the type of experiences we're going to have interiorly in order to, when we understand them, we will no longer fear them. Because what happens with somebody who is scrupulous is that they become afraid of things. They become afraid, and then they become uncertain. There's this first phase where you become afraid of the different things that are going on inside your mind. You're thinking you're committing mortal sins. You're thinking you're going to hell. So you're terrified, and then things are getting amplified. Because the problem then is that, not only do you have maybe a slight natural inclination maybe to be attracted to other people, now you're terrified of this. So again, like we began in the beginning of the video, the ironic process of the mind kicks in, and now you're having even more problems, supposedly, with impurity. Because now you're feeling attracted to everyone. And this can start getting out of hand, because you can start saying, oh, it would be terrible if I was attracted to this person, or that person, or this and that. And at this time, it's and all of a sudden, your life feels ruined. So that's why it's so important to understand this process. And when you also begin to understand that, I've said this in other videos, that, it's almost as if, you have these phases of sin, and that helps you understand what's dangerous and what's not. And I've said, we also have to understand that just because we have committed a mortal sin does not mean for certain that we will end up in hell, because although we deserve hell, we don't know if God will give us the graces necessary to repent. He might. So we're not certain that we are going to hell because we are certain that we've committed a mortal sin. So we should when we fall, many saints teach us not to be overly discouraged. Saint Maximilian Kolbe, Saint Therese of Lisieux, Saint Maximilian says to give all your guilt over to the Immaculate. Give her all your guilt, and entrusting it all to her. Obviously we have to go to confession, but he encourages us to kind of let this go. Saint Therese says, if we're really distressed about our faults and failings, then it's actually a sign of pride, because she says a little child does not fall very far. So when we're humble and small, we don't feel greatly distressed at our sins. And many saints say, like a Saint Pio talks about, we don't want to have such a crushing hatred of ourselves, when we do wrong, that's not from God, we want to have a genuine sorrow for hurting God more so. That type of thing is generally what I think he's referring to. So we can see these ways of talking about this, but for someone who's scrupulous, their experience is very much in line with what is described in a treatment that's called ICBT for obsessive compulsive disorder. There's a thing, it kind of begins with there is this thing that's a trigger. Then there's a way in which there's a thought well, okay, there's this, it kind of is like, or maybe let me explain it this way. It's kind of like a person, let's say we're, because I want to explain this problem of dealing with impurity. Let's say we're walking along, there's all of a sudden a sense, you see somebody, and there's a sense that there's an impure glance, which is one thing maybe possibly slightly rooted in the natural inclinations of our bodies, of our created nature, and then also the ironic process of the mind whereby the person is trying not to have those thoughts. So there is a thing of like the first movements of sin plus an amplification based on fear, which makes it seem to the person that they have given consent because this thing launches itself into the mind and then distresses them. Now, what else? So how are we going to stop this? So this launches itself, and then they start to wonder, did I consent? And then they go into thinking, okay, well, there's this trigger. Well, maybe I sinned. Maybe I'm going to go to hell. And then they say, well, that'd be terrible. They think that would be awful. Maybe I have to go to confession like 100 times. I just went to confession. And then they start to ruminate and they start to think and they start to behave compulsively, whether by, whether it is that a scrupulous person, whether I would go to confession again and again, or whether, it's just kind of ruminating and thinking it over again and again. So the real question is, we kind of have these two phases. One is this phase of like amplification at the beginning, and one is this one of rumination. And, and to understand this, to get out of this, we first of all want accurate knowledge. We want to understand these phases. We want to understand the anatomy of this. We want to understand which things are sin and which things are not. And I'm going to give some other principles also that'll help shore this up. And, somebody who has a background in moral theology can chime in and think about some different things. But I think that there's some other teachings that we want to cobble together in a way that makes sense. But the thing is, if we don't have accurate knowledge, then we can use our faith in a way that hurts us. So, for example, I read things about custody of the eyes, like treatise by like Saint Alphonsus of Liguori, and I took this and I interpreted this like in a fearful way that I felt, okay, I'm always going to be attracted to everyone improperly in a sinful way at all times. If I look at anyone, I have to look at the ground, and so. But meanwhile, St. Alphonsus does talk about how, doctors and people have to, examine their patients, and you just ignore the first movements of sin. So there's a little more complexity in some ways, in that teaching there. But the thing is, when I took this suggestion, I said, oh, wow, this is what the world is. I'm sinful. This means I'm always having these. And I also interpreted these first movements of sin that were being amplified by fear as meaning that, oh, I have concupiscence. I have a sin nature. I have these type of things going on inside me. I felt that, this is what this was, instead of understanding this combination of this amplification with the first movement. So we want to really gain a real understanding of, what teachings are in the background, because the thing is, what we need is a clear belief about what's happening. And there's a scene in Star Wars where Yoda, don't endorse levitating weird things with your mind. That's not a good thing to do in the real world. But we're in fantasy land with Yoda in a space age place. So it's okay. So Yoda is on a planet with Luke Skywalker, and there's a swamp, and the spaceship is in the swamp. I mean, it's an X-Wing, but I don't know if anybody's seen Star Wars, but spoiler alert, the X-Wing is in the swamp, and Yoda tells Luke to levitate it out of the swamp using the Force. And so what happens is that Luke tries to do this and fails. And Yoda says to him, do or do not, try not. There is no try. And then Yoda proceeds to levitate the thing out of the swamp without any problem. And Luke looks at it and says, I don't believe it. And Yoda says, that is why you fail. So this technique, when we've been building up toward these beliefs and understandings about scrupulosity, about the phases of sin, about the feelings that are going on in our minds when we're dealing with these intrusive perceptions or thoughts of impurity, we're getting our beliefs right. And a lot of times, if you struggle with overcoming and finding freedom from scrupulosity, both in the experience of intrusive perceptions or in ruminations, it's really the thing, like, we don't believe it. That is why we fail. We have a problem usually in our belief. We're not certain that, okay, we're not certain that what's going on is not sin. We're not certain about how it works. We're not certain about what type of actions are sinful or not. So whenever we get uncertain about the nature of what we're experiencing, that's a place to, I think, in my experience, that's the place to look for if you're experiencing failure in finding freedom from scrupulosity, because that is the place where like your mind is not settled. So that's the main thing there. So that's the issue with that. So I think that that's very important. And then now I'm going to explain exactly what to do. So there's been a few different ways that I've done this, and I'm going to explain a little bit. I'm just going to lead up through them. One thing that initially set me free was that I realized, I cried out to God one day about my sufferings with some of these experiences. And I was led to think about, I kind of felt led to look at this video about hypnosis the next day. And I realized by watching it that I had hypnotized myself by, taking like as a suggestion the things from like St. Alphonsus, that now I'm going to be attracted to everybody. I have to look down at the ground. I took it as almost like a hypnotic suggestion. And I came to associate, it was almost like I was hypnotized into, that this was going to be my experience. And so I realized that essentially I was kind of like reacting to like trance states. And it helped me to realize that it's not so much that like faces are intrinsically, like attraction always happens when we see a person. Like, that's not what faces do in themselves always. It's like, so there's this sense of, realizing that, separating that, and that was shocking. Once that like kind of shift happened, I was really able to like kind of look right at people, and I really there was a major shift in my life. It was one of probably the most liberating experiences in my life. So that was very powerful. And then the next experience that I had was with Dan Buglio's approach, which I've spoke about in other videos. This thing is about perceived dangers. So the thing is realizing that this type of flinching, that like I was afraid of people's faces or experiencing this kind of amplification of perceptions, that kind of made me think I was having impure glances at people because I was afraid of having impure glances. This was a perceived danger symptom. And when I watched his video course about perceived danger symptoms that are he talks about this thing in more of a medical context. But when I went to a nice event with my Catholic and otherwise religious friends or friends, it was a nice party. It was just like I went to this party and I was able to just have nice conversations with everybody and didn't have any. No distress over the first movements of sin, like and almost it almost felt like all the first movements of sin turned off too, like, in a way, because it was like they were so unimportant that I was not afraid of them, so I was able to just kind of be fearless and open in that experience because of these teachings and this understanding of it. So hopefully that helps as well. But the thing that was really hard for me to do was to communicate to people how to do this. How do you make this happen for you? And so what happened was that eventually I realized that the instruction you have to give is kind of like you don't try anything. It's just like, it's like Yoda said, do not try. You're not trying to do something. You just want to like notice first of all, like notice that like you have to believe the things like that you're not in danger by believing all the different stuff about the process, by having that understanding. This is all that's going on is amplification of first movements. You're not consenting to the things because it's just it's just apparent consent, like St. Francis de Sales talks about. It's like having these understandings of this thing begins to reduce the perceived danger, which reduces the amplifications, which makes your brain more calm. It's almost like by being on such high alert, like then you become uncertain because like your emotional center is on and as far as I understand it, and your cognitive center is off. So the more you're reducing the perceived danger, then the more you are enabling yourself to be able to have a clear head and realize that nothing bad is happening and just kind of go through life with a clear head. So this understanding is the key. So there also were times when, I might be deathly afraid of because this was going on for such a long time. I might be really afraid of like being in a certain situation. Sometimes I would talk to God about my feelings about it. That would happen a little bit also. Like I might say like, I'm really scared, I'm really scared. I'm just really scared. And keeping that focus on, not trying to, and here's an interesting thing. I'm going to throw this in. This has been a big shift. This is what I've been thinking about. So it's hard sometimes because we want to generally use indirect methods when dealing with impurity instead of direct methods. Like, so for example, you can sit down and question whether you should be proud and think about pride this way and that way and all the time. But you don't want to think about impure things in a direct way. Now, of course, what happens? Once you do that, now you're in the problem of the ironic process of the mind. Well, how can I resist indirectly? Well, the whole thing is like to try to, generally the idea is to try to do something else. But usually when you're already so afraid, it's kind of difficult to make the ironic process of the mind, so sometimes people will have techniques like, all right, think about like something fun that you otherwise enjoy. Like, okay, let's think about fishing. Let's move our mind here, or let's do something else that's constructive. And I think the thing is, maybe the one I would like out of this is just doing whatever is sensible, whatever you be otherwise doing that's meaningful in your life, just go back to doing that rather than specifically try to distract yourself. And that's a distinction. I think we don't want to try to distract ourselves. We want to try to engage with life. We want to do whatever would be otherwise meaningful. And this technique is even in line with the teachings of like different approaches against OCD, such as, the DARE response, which has a step called engage. And the steps of Dr. Schwartz, which has a final step about staying active do what makes sense. So we want to so this indirect resistance rather than try to distract yourself or even try to you can't debate with impure thoughts. You don't want to debate them. You don't want to fight with them. You don't want to overly focus on them. But here's the question: how do you, if that's the case, how do you get out of all this? Well, here's the deal. How do we not go crazy then? Try and not think about them, I think the thing is that we want to use a method. We want to understand this. There's a story of a butcher. That's just a story. I think it's from Japan or something, where, he's cutting meat and they're wondering, why is his knife never getting dull? He says, well, I only cut in the empty space. I cut between the joints and so on and so forth. And I think that in a way, the kind of indirect, I think there's a way in which this technique I'm going to describe is very simple, leads you to kind of get out of this problem of avoidance and allows you to kind of, in a way, resist it indirectly because you're kind of moving through the space in between. Now, how does this look? Well, I think in the phase of rumination, so when you're going through life, you want to simply notice that you are free. Now, that sounds nuts. So what I mean by this is I want you to notice that there's not a problem. Just notice as you're going through a situation. So for example, I'm going to share this because I think this will be helpful to you. So I went to an event today where there were all kinds of people. It was a church event. There were all kinds of things going on. And ordinarily, it would be terrible. It would be I would have to be guarding my eyes in a horrified manner the whole time. That would be my normal way of looking at things. But while I'm there, what I'm doing is I'm noticing the way in which there's not a problem. I'm noticing the way in which I'm free. I'm noticing that there's nothing wrong. So when my mind wants to start to flinch and say, oh no, you're going to think a terrible thought, or you're going to look at that person, you just notice, you're just noticing how there's nothing wrong. And this focus is very powerful because what you're doing is in that moment, you're using an indirect resistance principle because you're looking at the place where there's no problem. You're not looking at the first movements of sin you don't even need to because you're just looking, you're saying, okay, because you know these principles in the back of your mind. You know that the first movement of sin is not a sin. You know all this stuff. So you're just noticing almost in this kind of just awareness type way. You're just being you're just looking at things if anything begins, any first movement just kind of crosses your mind. You're just realizing that it's not dangerous. You're just realizing that there's not a problem. You're realizing that that you're safe because you have a savior. You're realizing all these other principles that are in and you're noticing other ways in which you're fine and that you're free. You're noticing how it's okay. And you just allow that to be the focus because that's the reality. You see, when you have this deep fear in ICBT, they talk about the feared self. And when we have this deep fear that we're going to do this wrong thing, then what happens is when you see a trigger, all of a sudden your mind lifts off into the imagination. You're thinking, maybe this, maybe that. The thing is, in reality, we want to see through this. These problems are not solid. You don't have a problem. You don't have religious scrupulosity as a thing that you have. It's something that you do. It's something that you've been doing it so long that you don't know how to stop doing it. But it's not something that you have. It's not something that you statically have, something broken in you. Like that's like you're not a special kind of broken. You're broken just like everybody else who is sinful and has a fallen nature. But you're not a special kind of broken. There is this way in which you just kind of realize there's nothing wrong. Or another way you could do this is like if you're in the rumination phase, wondering, did you sin? You can notice your doubts. Just notice that you're in doubt. And there's a principle in moral theology, which is when in doubt, it doesn't count. So if you have doubt about any of those criteria of mortal sin, do I doubt that it is wrong, or I really thought it was terribly wrong? Do I doubt that do I think I may have been impaired? Was I asleep? Do I have any doubt about whether I really fully consented to that thought? Do I doubt whether I had sufficient reflection? If you have doubt, you just notice that. And this technique is very much like, it's almost like you're in a jail cell because when you're having these thoughts, you're like trapped. And what you're doing is you're not having to break the bars or shake on the bars or yell at the bars or try to do anything like that. What you do is you look between the bars. You say, let me just notice the way in which I'm uncertain. And then when you notice you're uncertain, you automatically can say, I don't know that I've done this. Therefore, when in doubt, it doesn't count. And in those situations, when you have genuine doubt like that, and when you have scrupulosity, you have you can use this principle, when in doubt, it doesn't count. And this is, everybody can kind of use indubitas libertas. That's the Latin, because it's this principle. When we don't know if there's an obligation, we may proceed without the dread of sin. Like, it's like, do I know that I need to rescue every worm on this sidewalk in the rain with cars going by? No, I have doubt about that obligation, so I don't have to. So I can drive without dread of sin, squishing worms. It's like So we have this doubt. So the thing is, oh, here comes the chipmunk. Hello. So the thing is, this is really a very powerful thing. But the key here is this technique is in this word notice. Notice that you're free. Notice that freedom that you have. Notice that there's no problem. And as you understand these principles in the background and begin to notice how they apply to your situation, you just start to notice that you don't have a problem, that you're not, that there's nothing wrong, that you're safe. You start to notice that you're free, and when you start to notice this, so for example, I was talking to all different people, I'm seeing these, there might be very slight movements of sin, or slight amplifications and stuff like that, but you just notice that you're safe. You just notice, oh wow, look at how I'm safe. And you just, I'm trying to describe it to you because I want to transmit it to you. I want you to be able to live this. But it was amazing to be able to just kind of be safe and have that experience. So that is something that I think can be really helpful. You're just kind of noticing how you're safe. You're noticing how you're noticing that there's nothing bad happening, that you're not doing anything wrong. So that's something that's very important to be able to do. So I think that should be able to help you with these challenges. And so I hope that that is something that will be able to kind of lead you to find that freedom from this form of scrupulosity. And so I think that ultimately, it's kind of like that. That's what I really wanted to share and add that to some of the things that I've recorded previously. And so we close in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.